From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana.
I've been sleeping so much better by just having one of these before I go to bed at night. They come in little packets like this. It's like dissolvable paper. You place it on your tongue, it will dissolve within 30 seconds. A few moments later, you will drift off to sleep.
TikTok is a breeding ground for all sorts of surprising new fads. And the latest seems to be the rise of the sleepfluencers.
There's actually a military-proven technique to fall asleep in
Puts your bed in the exact temperature you need to get the deepest level of REM.
Magnesium is the best for muscle recovery, so I like to
I used the Sleepy Girl mocktail today. It's supposed to make you sleep like a baby, so I'm really excited.
Yeah, you can just take melatonin, but I think this is more fun.
There's a cacophony of advice on how we can all sleep better. And that's in addition to all the latest apps and trackers and rings and watches monitoring every minute of it. So why is it that so many people feel like they're still not getting enough sleep? The story today: how our obsession with sleep is ruining our sleep.
My name is Tom Whipple, and I am the science editor at The Times.
And Tom, are you a good sleeper?
I'm afraid I am. I don't want to sort of, I'm touching all sorts of wood now. Well, you say that and then you think, God, I'm going to end up becoming a terrible insomniac, and I'll remember the blitheness with which I say this, because I know that it sort of blights people's lives. But at the moment, so far as I can tell, I go to bed and 8 hours later I wake up.
That's despite having kids.
Well, there was a period when that wasn't the case. But yes, my kids now, broadly speaking, sleep as well.
And Tom, we now have an entire industry that allows you to track your sleep. Have you ever used any of those trackers, any of those sleep aids?
I have used trackers professionally. I tried out one of these sort of smart rings just recently.
A smart ring?
It is a ring on your finger, and it's there to do all sorts of things. It measures pulse and movement and all of these things, and it tells you whether you're asleep. And so I wore that, and that was interesting, I guess. Broadly speaking, I was asleep when I expected to be asleep. I did also try out one of these mattresses, one of these super duper mattresses. And so the idea is that at different stages in your sleep, you need to be at different temperatures, and you get warm and you get cold and all of these things. And it's a mattress that tries to match that. It's basically got a fridge and a heater attached to your mattress that warms up or cools down water that then pumps into it, and then it wakes you up with a gentle vibration in the morning. I tried it up and I found that and I'm sure there are other people who I think find them brilliant, but for me, I found it just kept me awake. I would be listening for the gurgle as it changed to a different mode of operation. And then I'd find that I haven't been so exhausted since I had newborns. For me, it was very, very bad value. I was obviously trying this out for work as well, so I didn't drop $3,000 on a mattress.
Just as well. I thought I'd heard about a lot of the trackers. I hadn't heard about the ring, and I hadn't heard about the mattress. There is a whole industry, isn't there? What is possible? What can you buy to try and help you sleep?
If you go on TikTok and look at some of the sleepfluencers or sleep maxers, there are people who have these sort of aspirational sleep lifestyles where you can copy what they do and see how they maximize their sleep in all of these clever ways. And if you go on them, you'll see all sorts of gadgets. Obviously, you've got the Fitbits, you've got the phone under the pillow, you've got your weighted mattresses to put on top, you've got all sorts of tinctures and ointments and things that do things to your feet. And then obviously you've got the eye mask masks that measure what's going on in your brain to try to work out whether you're asleep. You've got all of these things. There is a vast industry. I mean, much like the other two pillars of the milking stool of life, the diet and exercise, we've got the sleep providing the third one, and they're all equally important, and they're therefore all ways to make a lot of money if you so wish.
And there was a trial that you've looked at Oxford University that actually looked at some of these sleep trackers and how they affect sleep. Just tell us a bit about how that was conducted.
Yeah, this was when they first came out, and the worry that they were particularly concerned about was that they just weren't that reliable, and they've got better, but they're still not brilliant all the time. And they were worried that, what happens if they're giving people unreliable data. Well, and so in this study, they gave people sleep trackers, and people wore them over the course of several nights, and they reported back on how they felt the next day to see how well the data that the sleep tracker gave them correlated to how they felt. So if they had a poor sleep score, did they have a poor day? And that's exactly what they found. They found that if people did have a poor sleep score, then the next day they weren't as sharp, they weren't as happy, they didn't feel they were going through life with the sort of level of vim and vigour they'd like. So in that sense, the correlation was extremely good, and it did seem like the score that people got very much affected their next day. But there was a rather big catch.
Aha. Here's the plot twist.
So the catch was that the scores were entirely made up. They were giving people fake data and seeing the extent to which we were suggestible. And the extent to which this single number that we ascribe to our sleep, whether it's time or score or whatever, was actually something that then had a psychological effect. And, maybe if we get a good one, we feel better than we actually are. And we get in a car and we drive when we really shouldn't be getting in a car and driving. But maybe if we get a bad one, we feel worse than we should. And we sort of imagine our lives as being these sort of unpleasant, sleep-deprived lives when actually they're nothing of the sort.
That's amazing. So even people who'd had a good night's sleep woke up, looked at a bad score and decided they must be a bit subpar.
Well, one presumes so. I mean, they didn't actually measure their sleeps. They just measured the correlation between the fake sleeps and the real lives. But yes, one should presume that. And, if you speak to sleep researchers, they will all have variants on the same story, where someone comes in and they are absolutely convinced that their sleep is horrific and that this is blighting their lives. And they'll try all sorts of things to improve the sleep, and the sleep researchers won't manage anything. And eventually they'll get them into the lab and they will measure their sleep properly, and they will discover that these people who claim to be watching every hour of the night tick over on their digital clock were actually getting a perfectly reasonable 8 hours and, having a very good night's sleep.
Isn't that bizarre? And yet we are all convinced that, our lives aren't quite right if we feel like we haven't slept enough. Just stepping back, explain why that is. I mean, what is sleep? Why do we do it?
Well, that's not an easy question to answer.
Oh, good.
So why do we biologically sleep? This is something that's a very active area of research. And the problem is sleep is a very strange thing to do. If you are an animal, then to incapacitate yourself for a third of the day, to not be able to do those things that make animals successful, but worse, to have you vulnerable, extremely vulnerable to predators and to danger. This is not a sensible thing to do. So there has to be some really big benefits of it. Otherwise, some animal will have evolved to not need sleep and it'll have taken over the world. In a sense, there's not a mystery in that we know there are very big benefits to sleep. There's been a whole swathe of research that has shown how poor sleep, genuinely poor sleep, is correlated, it's associated with all sorts of illnesses, dementia, cancer, obesity, metabolic disorders, all of these things. And it's probably causing some of them. Anyway, there's lots of evidence of this. There's lots of evidence that fundamental biological processes go on when you're asleep, that you clear toxins from your brain, all sorts of things. So in that sense, it's obvious that it's valuable. But of course, we've evolved to do these things, perhaps because we're asleep. And, maybe the brain thinks this is a good time to clear toxins from my brain because I'm asleep. That's not really the explanation for why we sleep. Now, I spoke to Russell Foster, who's a very eminent circadian neuroscientist, and he says, look, this is simple. We live in a world that is characterized, the biggest thing that happens every day is it gets dark and it gets light, and you have to choose as an animal, which are you going to specialize in? And once you've chosen to specialize in dark or specialize in light, then it's just better for you to just accept you're not very good in the one that you're not specialised in and shut yourself down. So maybe that's the answer, but I don't think anyone's particularly satisfied. But then as to what sleep is, that's a slightly easier question, but only slightly easier. It's this just phenomenally complex metabolic cascade of stuff in your brain. It begins with these, I love these, they're called clock genes. And what the genes do is they make a protein. And when the protein is made, it stops the gene making other proteins. But the really amazing thing is it is then degraded by another set of proteins in a process that lasts just over 24 hours. So this is the beat of your clock. This thing turns up, it's made, it stops the gene making more copies of itself, but then it breaks until it can then make more copies of itself. So once every 24 hours, you get this rhythm. And that's your internal rhythm. And then that feeds down to the rest of the body and all of the things that your body has to do differently in day and night. And what happens in a lot of people when you get sleep problems is somehow this central clock is out of sync. And we experience it being out of sync when we get jet lag. And we can, in a sense, induce jet lag in all sorts of ways. And probably the simplest way is light. There's good evidence that this clock is set and reset and kept to its 24-hour beat through the use of light in the morning and in the evening. We have receptors in our eyes that we have the receptors in our eyes that you'll have learnt about at school, the rods and the cones that are there to pick out the images. There's a third receptor, which has only really been properly understood recently. And it's work by Russell Foster at Oxford. And this is just there to measure light and dark. It's there to measure brightness. And people can be blind, but they still have this. So even though they're not aware of it, their eyes are measuring light and darkness. And that's what's keeping them in train with the world outside and ensuring that blind people don't always have terrible jet lag. But there are blind people who don't have this third receptor either, and they live their lives in quite unpleasant state of being permanently out of sync with the world because they can't set their master clock each day.
Gosh, I can't imagine anything more disorientating. So this is basically light dictating through something in the eye, dictating your circadian rhythm.
Yeah, it's the light is the thing. So if you think, it's kind of like an old pendulum clock. The pendulum keeps reasonably good time, but you have to wind it and you have to set it. Otherwise, it'll end up completely out of sync. And that's what our master clock is. It'll keep ticking along, but it'll get more and more out of sync unless you set it with the light.
And Tom, it does feel like in the modern world, sleep is a real obsession. A lot of people feel like we're not getting enough. What about our ancestors? Going back to ancient versions of us, how did they sleep?
Well, we obviously don't know. We can't tell what they were up to in caveman times, but the next closest thing we can do is go and visit hunter-gatherer tribes. I must say I'm always slightly suspicious of hunter-gatherer tribes because, well, not them, but them in studies for the simple reason that there are so many studies on tribes like the Hadza in Tanzania that you half imagine there must be a permanent encampment of anthropologists next to them. But we go and look at these tribes that live how we imagined our ancestors lived. And there was a study that looked at them across, in Africa and South America and looked to see how they sleep. And I think we had an idea that they would go to sleep with the dusk and wake up with the dawn and have this ancestral evolved sleep cycle that's completely different to ours. What they found is that most of them stay up for 2-3 hours after dusk. They'll go to sleep. They will, on average, have less than 7 hours sleep, but there's a lot of variation within them. Some of them will be restless sleepers. They'll wake up, they'll prod the fire for a bit, chat to someone, have a smoke, and then go back to bed. It's not this lost Eden, this idyll of sleep maxing that we imagine. But in one way it was. There's one way in which it did seem so very different from the modern world, and that's that they had to have the word insomnia explained to them. They didn't really understand the word, they didn't have the word,
Oh, wow.
and it didn't apply to their lives.
I mean, that sounds like they're getting some very good sleep.
They weren't stressing about it in the same way. You know, breathing is very important, but I don't spend my life thinking, am I breathing enough? And they were very much the same for sleep, it seemed. And when the scientists then quizzed them further about if they'd experienced the symptoms of insomnia, even if they didn't have a word for insomnia, again, they really hadn't, not at all to the degree that we do in the West. And so it did feel like something was different. And now, if you wanted my guess, it's a mix of not having sort of got this sort of maybe slight cultural contagion of anxiety, but more likely they have a day connected to the light. They don't spend their afternoon stuck in a podcast recording office without any windows and soundproof walls. You know, they are there in nature, experiencing the cues that they should, doing the exercise that they should, and as a consequence, the evolved patterns of sleep that we should have are the ones that they experience.
And I suppose if they have had bad sleep one night, they don't have an alarm clock telling them they've got to be up and somewhere at a certain time.
That's the other thing. The other thing we've done is entrained our sleep. We've created artificial hours. If you go to places, for instance, like I think they still do this on Mount Athos, the Greek monastic peninsula, there you will find that the night is divided from dusk to dawn into a set number of variable length hours, and the day into variable length hours as well.
Wow. I love the idea of that.
Yeah, I mean, time used to be determined by that, but then the pendulum clock turned up and we were all needed at the factory gates at 8 a.m., whether it was 8 a.m. in the dark of winter or 8 a.m. after 4 hours of sunlight in the height of summer. And that was what 8 a.m. was. But this concept of time unconnected to the sun would be something that would have completely baffled our ancestors.
Tom, clearly the tribes are incredibly lucky in not experiencing any problems with their sleep, but insomnia is a problem that we are very well acquainted with in our part of the world. What's causing the modern anxiety around sleep? What are we sleeping worse? And if so, why? What's causing it?
I think we probably are sleeping worse. Certainly the levels of insomnia that are recorded in the West are very different to those in our hunter-gatherer colleagues who don't live our lifestyle. There is also a problem of over-anxiety with sleep. I spoke to a sleep researcher who had coined the word orthosomnia.
Tell us about that.
Well, this idea, it comes after the word sort of orthorexia, which is now, I think, recognised eating disorder, which isn't about eating too much or too little, but it's about precisely trying to control what you do. So the woman is a researcher called Kelly Barron from Utah University, and she, along with colleagues, wrote down these case studies of people who seemed to be just obsessed with their sleep trackers, and if they didn't get their 8 hours, then they assumed that everything that went wrong in their lives was linked to that. And she coined this word orthosomnia, and she's now working with international colleagues to come up with a sort of international scale of orthosomnia. And this seems to be something that everyone notices who's in the field. And for everyone, to be clear, it's, this is a real minority, but there do seem to be people who've just taken it a little bit too far and maybe need to chill out, because we can be obsessed with the right exercise or the right diet, and the act of being obsessed with it is enough to achieve it, for good or for ill. You know, if I am obsessed with doing my 10K or having my 5 a day, this is something that I can achieve. But one of the oddities of sleep is you can't obsess your way into being better at sleep. In fact, it does exactly the opposite. And so this anxiety is not only is it perhaps not healthy, it can be actively counterproductive.
So the anxiety about sleeping is causing worse sleep. What else about modern life? What is it about our lifestyles that means we're probably sleeping a little bit worse than our ancestors?
The biggest is just not being outdoors and getting that blast of morning sun. We probably are eating slightly wrong, eating late, eating big late. We end our evenings extremely stimulated with a lot of information. One of the things that the people I've spoken to say isn't really a concern that we do concern ourselves with is screens late at night. The amount of light that you're getting off of them is pretty small. And the evidence that actually real screens late at night are making a difference is also not that clear. But these things combined, along with a lifestyle that, means that we have to get up at a set time, and whatever the weather, whatever the time of year, probably means that when our bodies aren't existing with the cues that they used to have being quite so strong and quite so clear.
That's so interesting, because I've heard people putting on red glasses at a certain time because they're convinced blue light from screens is sort of causing problems. But, given all of that and everything that you've looked into, what are your top tips for people who are struggling?
I realise I'm coming from a position of sleep privilege.
Tell us how you do it.
As someone, tell us how I do it. I am simply and purely and solely lucky, but the sleep restriction thing seems to be, along with cognitive behavioural therapy, seems to be one of the best evidenced ways of dealing with sleep and really bringing it back under control. And that involves, not trying to sacrifice your day napping and trying to make up on the hours you missed the night before. And then the second thing clearly is sunlight. And given that's the case, and given we are living very different lives from when that biology evolved, it's not surprising.
I've heard listening to podcasts is a great way of drifting off. Is this just the latest wellness fad? Or is this actually a much more profound problem that's probably here to stay?
No, I don't think it's a wellness fad at all. I think there are really important things we can do with our knowledge of how important sleep is, such as, if you're designing a hospital, people who spent the night in hospital will realise it's almost impossible to sleep in a hospital. And this thing that's so important for health, in the place where your health is already in a bad state, if you can't do it, that's really bad. So the idea that sleep should be built into our understanding of what a healthy life is so crucial. But then perhaps in order to achieve it, we have to spend a little less time thinking about it. And that is the irresolvable paradox.
That was Tom Whipple, science editor at The Times. And all of his writing on this and lots of other fascinating subjects can be found at thetimes.com with a subscription. Today's producer was Olivia Case, the executive producer was Kate Ford, and sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. Do leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode, or do pass it on to anybody who you think should hear it. Thanks for listening. See you again soon.